So here we are on study 4 of our gifts series. In this study I want to look at growing in gifts. Sometimes we can be given the impression that because the gifts have a supernatural origin, because they have a divine origin, that we have very, very little control over them. And I would have some sympathy with that idea if it wasn't for what Paul says in 1 Corinthians, because it seems there that we can grow in gifts. So I want to just try and give you a number of pointers that will help you to grow in the gifts that God has given to you. First of all, we're told that we should desire gifts. People say things sometimes like we should desire the giver and not just the gifts. Well, I can understand that because we don't want to be just chasing after gifts. We want to have a deeper relationship with God. But we need to remember too that Paul tells us that we should desire spiritual gifts. And even Jesus said that God is a good Father who wants to give us and gives us good gifts, especially the Holy Spirit. Matthew 7, 9 to 11 and Luke 11, 11 to 13. 1 Corinthians 12, 31 says, "Now eagerly desire the greater gifts." And 14:1, "Follow the way of love and eagerly desire gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy." Paul states clearly that we should not just seek the giver of the gifts, but also the gifts themselves. And he talks about greater gifts and especially prophecy. So why would he talk about desiring greater gifts, and why would he talk about desiring prophecy in particular? I think when he talks about the greater gifts, he's probably referring to gifts that have that are going to be the best gifts, or the most appropriate gifts for any given situation. Or he might be referring to seeking gifts that are really going to build up the church. And I think that's why he talks a lot about prophecy. He wants the church to be seeking gifts which will build other people up. So we're to desire gifts. So if we're to desire gifts and we're to receive gifts, we need to ask ourselves the question, how do we receive gifts? How can we receive gifts? One way that we can receive gifts is through the laying on of hands. In Acts 8:19, we found that the Spirit was given through the laying on of the apostles' hands. But then again, sometimes people received the Spirit and spoke in tongues without anybody laying their hands on them, like in Acts chapter 10 in Cornelius' household. Timothy received a spiritual gift through the laying on of Paul's hands, 2 Timothy 1:6, and he received a gift when the elders laid their hands on him, and 1 Timothy 4:14 talks about that. So laying on of hands is a way in which a gift can be received. Another way that we receive gifts is through faith. It probably goes without saying that we need a measure of faith to operate any spiritual gift. Faith is singled out in Galatians 3 as the key factor in receiving the Spirit and in seeing and the miraculous at work. Here's what Paul says. He says, "I would like to learn just one thing from you. Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law, or by believing what you heard? Are you so foolish? After beginning by means of the Spirit, are you now trying to finish by means of the flesh?" Laying on of hands is no substitute for faith. Faith gives us the confidence and boldness to speak out. We don't receive the gifts of the Spirit by being passive. We have to actively desire them. So I want to encourage you to desire spiritual gifts. Ask for people to pray for you. Pray for one another and take those steps of faith. A second aspect of growing in our gifts is that of developing our gifts. If the gifts of the Spirit are gifts of the Spirit and have a divine origin, then how can we develop them? Well, that's a good question. And if Paul hadn't made one particular statement, I don't think we could talk about developing gifts. But here's what he says in verse 12 of 1 Corinthians 14. He says, "Since you're eager for gifts of the Spirit, try to excel in those that build up the church." He doesn't say how to excel, he just says try to excel. Since he doesn't explain how to do this, it's safe to say that we excel in gifts the way that we excel in other areas of our faith. So what do I mean by that? Well, I think if Paul hasn't given us specific instructions, we should just go back to those general things, those general practices that help us to develop our relationship with God. Things like reading our Bible, things like praying, things like meditation, things like spending time in God's presence, things like worship, maybe fasting, some of those spiritual disciplines that enable us to grow in our relationship with God. If we grow in our relationship with God, our faith will grow, and our openness to the Spirit should grow as well. So the main point that Paul makes is, and that I want to make, is that we can excel in gifts. We can develop our gifts. And I would say to you, if you're serious about developing your gifts, put yourself in a context where you can use them. Connect groups or small groups, prayer groups, they're the best environment for using gifts. Another thing that Paul says here, and this is probably the most important part of developing your gifts, he says that we're to follow the way of love. 1 Corinthians 13. This isn't just a wedding chapter. This is a chapter that's all to do with spiritual gifts. The Corinthian church was a church that was big on power but small on love. The result was that even though it was an incredibly gifted church, it was also an incredibly damaged church. If you read through 1 and 2 Corinthians, you'll find issue after issue that Paul has to address. And really it all comes down to a lack of love. Power without love can be incredibly destructive. You can have amazing gifts, but without love, they are worthless, according to 1 Corinthians 13, 1-3. Even the greatest of the gifts will fail, but love, Paul says, never fails. Verse 8 of 1 Corinthians 13. And if you want to know what it looks like to follow the way of love, he sets it out very clearly. He says, love is patient, love is kind, love does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it's not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Paul wanted the Corinthians to desire spiritual gifts, but he wanted them also to follow the way of love. Again, back to 1 Corinthians 14, verse 1. Follow the way of love and eagerly desire gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy. If we follow the way of love and eagerly desire spiritual gifts, we have a powerful combination that will unlock God's blessing over the lives of people, churches, and communities.